All right, back on Bad Faith Podcast. Matt Stoller. You know him as the king of Monopoly News. He also has a Substack, Big by Matt Stoller. Matt, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
No, I should introduce you more formally than that. You are the research director for the American Economic Liberties Project. You really are my go-to person to look to for sort of anti-monopoly news. Your most recent post on your Substack points out some sort of under-observed news, which is that Mark Zuckerberg, of course, the founder of Facebook, says he wants everyone to have access to an AI chatbot therapist. As someone who is dating therapists currently and is going to have to end this episode abruptly at an hour because I'm going to have my second date with a new one. How crazy is this? And how likely is this to manifest?
I mean, the context. So he's been saying, he says he's a social engineer, right? And he's always been a social engineer. Since he started Facebook, he thinks very hard about what motivates people and how he can structure devices and products and platforms to get them to do the things that he thinks they should do, or the things that he thinks they want to do, which I don't know that he distinguishes between those two things. And he's able to do that because he has a lot of market power, right? So it's not just like lots of people have weird ideas. But why do we care about Mark Zuckerberg's ideas? It's because he controls these platforms that have billions of people and can force feed his view of humanity onto those platforms and onto billions of people. So he's on this kick where he's like, sociological research shows that most Americans have 3 friends or fewer, and they want more than that. And so can we do something about this loneliness epidemic? He's been talking about this for years. So there's this clip going around where he talks about how, Americans on average have 3 friends, they want more. And the kind of implication is, we can just do AI chatbot friends, right? And that's kind of what everyone took away.
I think as the personalization loop kicks in and the AI just starts to get to know you better and better, I think that will just be really compelling. One thing just from working on social media for a long time is there's this stat that I always think is crazy. The average American, I think it's fewer than 3 friends. 3 people that they'd consider friends. And the average person has demand for meaningfully more. I think it's like 15 friends or something, right? I guess there's probably some point where you're like, all right, I'm just too busy. I can't deal with more people. But the average person wants more connection than they have. So there's a lot of questions that people ask of stuff like, okay, is this going to replace kind of in-person connections or real life connections? And my default is that the answer to that is probably no. I think I think that there are all these things that are better about kind of physical connections when you can have them, but the reality is that people just don't have the connection and they feel more alone a lot of the time than they would like. So I think that a lot of these things that today there might be a little bit of a stigma around, I would guess that over time, we will find the vocabulary as a society to be able to articulate why that is valuable and why the people who are doing these things are why they are rational for doing it and how it is adding value for their lives. But also I think that the field is very early. So, it's I think, there are a handful of companies and stuff who are doing virtual therapist and, there's virtual girlfriend type stuff, but it's very early.
But in another interview, he says, well, I think everyone should have a therapist. And not everybody, there really aren't enough therapists and not everybody can afford one. And so, but everyone should at least have access to an AI chatbot therapist or AI tools. And one of the interesting things about that statement is that it reflects a basic lack of understanding of what therapists owe to their patients, right? Because therapists are licensed, right? They have ethical obligations. In some cases, they take the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. They can't tell you, say, you should kill yourself. They can't, they have obligations to keep your data secret or to keep what they tell you secret. They're not trying to sell you things. There's all these things that we just sort of, when you say a therapist, it's not just a person who talks to you and like gives you advice and listens to you and has some training. There are a
No, that's
bunch
a
of
friend. That's the thing that apparently people don't have more than two or three of.
well, that's right. But like a therapist is a trained medical professional, right?
Of course.
And when a therapist like does something, sleeps with a patient, we're like, oh, that's terrible, right? Because we understand that they have ethical obligations. And so to just sort of say, oh, we should have like AI chatbot therapists when there's no these things lie, they make things up, they spy on you to try to they help sell you stuff, like that's a really dystopian vision of the world. And presumably, I think one of the things that Mark Zuckerberg was implying, although not saying, is Meta is going to be the one that is able to make a bunch of these tools or use a bunch of these tools. And so it's what he's saying is, I think, really dystopian, but it also is a reflection of the market power that he has. And I think that's really where we like what I think a lot of people miss, which is that this isn't about a creepy guy. This is about a guy who has enormous amounts of power because he has control over this really important, very profitable social infrastructure.
I'd like you to say more about that, actually, because I found myself repeatedly surprised by how long the legs on the AI business are. I mean, I think there was a part of me that felt like, well, knowing how to read and write and write an email and do these basic tasks is already a skill that I possess. I'm of an older generation, obviously a pre-AI ChatGPT generation. And it has always felt like it has very limited utility for me. But it does feel like every day there's a new application that emerges. I'm listening to, the new Amy Stoller podcast with Quinta Brunson, and they're talking about some AI cat that she can't stop watching on TikTok. I log into your Substack and I'm hearing that apparently all of our therapists are going to be are going to be AI. I'm reading sort of apocalyptic stories about the amount of energy that's being used for people doing. I read that people trying to be polite to the AI increases the processing needs of the computers that do the grokking by some amount of percent, so that people think that they're just being kind and not like beating up robots in case they turn on us later in the future. But in fact, they're just polluting the environment even faster. And it feels like I can't escape it. Is part of why it feels so ubiquitous simply because of the market share that these companies have that are making it my life and making it my issue and making it inescapable for me?
Well, okay. So first, let me just take the premise of the question and like not challenge it, but sort of discuss it.
Sure.
Is AI really everywhere? And the answer is no, it's not. The talking about AI is like a popular elite thing to do. I was just watching CNBC this morning, and Paul Tudor Jones, who's some hedge fund billionaire guy, was saying, "Oh my gosh, AI is going to destroy everything, and we really need to get a hold on this technology or whatever." It's like part of it is, this is just like Clippy, right? This is super Clippy, or this is just shitty autocorrect, right? Or super autocorrect, however you want to call it. It's not like it's really useful if you're coding. That's one important use case. Machine learning is useful in lots of ways, taking in sets of data and then extrapolating patterns. But it's not like so far, they've been talking about how we're going to create God since 2022. Remember ChatGPT came out. It's not as important as they said it was in 2022. Like, I don't know of a hit song that's been created with AI. And like, they were like, oh my gosh, you're going to replace everything with AI. So this is bullshit, right? Or at least a large part of it is hype and bullshit. And you have to ask why. And I'm not saying that it's not going to make all these changes. I'm just going to say it hasn't. And the predictions these people have made have not come true. But the reason that it is being pushed into all of these discussions is because there's so much money that's reliant on this stuff turning out to be really successful and profitable, which, by the way, it's not right now, that they have to keep pushing it, right? I think big tech companies are spending, $200, $300, $400 billion on chips that are just going to be training these models and serving these models. And there's a ton of investment going into this area. None of it is, or very, like, there's a couple of, the ServiceNow is profitable. They do customer service, but that's just worsening the customer service experience and saving money by doing that. Like, none of it is profitable. and there's so much money riding on it that there's like it has to be successful. It can't just be a bubble.
It's a bubble.
Therefore, they're going to be just talking to you about how important it is and how it's going to change everything. And it's like the promise is they never had to say the internet is going to change everything. It was just like, oh, here's a cool thing I can do. I don't have to write a letter and put a stamp on it and put it in the mail and wait 3 days for it to get to someone. I just type and click send and it's there instantly. You don't have to hype that. That's really cool technology that does something fundamentally different and transformative and allows you to send email to anyone in the world. That was a really big deal. There are all sorts of technologies like that. This one, they have to keep saying how it's going to change everything. And I'm just sort of like, maybe, but you're not saying that because you actually think that. You're saying that because there are all sorts of social incentives and all sorts of financial incentives that are creating an environment where people they kind of have to believe that, because if they don't, all this, a bunch of stocks are going to go down. There's going to all sorts of consequences. So I just want to like put that out. And then with, Mark Zuckerberg is spending 70, 80, 90 billion dollars, however much he's spending on these chips. Part of it is that they are making a bet on AI, and they're all making the same bet because nobody ever got fired for buying IBM is the expression, or you can be you can be wrong as long as you're wrong with everyone else. And so part of it is there's massive overinvestment going into this space, in my view, or at least there's investment going into this space, and it's all really a guess that this technology might be transformative in some way we can't imagine. I'm not there yet. I just don't buy it.
Yeah, I am skeptical as well, but it does feel a little bit like, I will admit, embarrassingly, that I didn't think that that Uber was gonna work. Famously, it was not profitable for all of these years, but as a New Yorker, I couldn't fathom why I would wait. Call and wait for a car to show up and not just walk outside the restaurant and stick my arm out. I appreciate that's not how the rest of the world works, but that was my existence at the time, and it does feel like.
Let me sort of suggest that you were right. Uber didn't work because so hailing a cab, it's basically hailing a cab. It's a replacement for taxi hailing service, right? That's all it is. It's a taxi management service. And then it was subsidized by Saudi money for 10 years so that they could gain market power over taxi cab dispatchers. That's all it was.
Right.
And it's like,
right.
That should have been illegal, right? That's predatory pricing. You shouldn't be able to borrow money or get investment money, underprice someone, drive them out of the market, and then raise prices later. That used to be an antitrust violation, or it used to be a legal violation. But they did it because we stopped enforcing that particular law in about the 80s and 90s. And so, Uber, now it's kind of successful, but it wasn't really technology. There wasn't a lot of cool technology there. It just was an improvement to taxi dispatching, and it was a specific model for how to do that. It would have happened anyway. It would have probably been a lot better if it hadn't been controlled by this one asshole. But so I just want to kind of it's not.
Right, but that's the point I was actually trying to make, is that it's because these corporations are able to artificially lower the price in this sort of Amazon model and drive out competition, including the taxi cab companies, which were in the process of adopting the same technology that enabled you to just call a yellow cab, a medallion cab, to your place the same way you would call an Uber. But Uber was able to offer these competitive prices for a short amount of time and then crush all the kind of competitors.
Can I bring this? I want to mention a company called Empower. Have you heard of Empower?
Sure. I don't think so.
No, so it's this DC. It's in DC, and it's a competitor to Uber and Lyft. And what they do is they basically do the same thing as Uber and Lyft, except they don't charge, they don't pay drivers. What they do is they let drivers buy their technology for a small licensing fee, and then they let those drivers set their own price. And it's a better system, and the drivers get to set their own price, and users like it. But the DC City Council, prompted by Uber and Lyft, is trying to drive them out of business, saying they're not adhering to ride hailing standards and whatever. So it's there is a lot of innovation and opportunity in these markets that could have actually allowed people to flourish. And what these guys are, Uber was always a financial play more than it was anything about innovation. That's one of the things that really irritates me about talking about technology, which is that the way we talk about technology today is we're often really talking about a kind of camouflaged version of finance. And then you sort of place the veneer of technology on top of it. So it sounds like cool and different and valuable, but really it's just a bunch of bankers manipulating markets. That's not how we used to talk about technology, but that is how we talk about technology today. It really annoys me. Sorry, I'm a hater.
No, we love to hear you hate. Let me direct your hate back toward Meta. I did want to ask you about this FTC versus Meta antitrust trial.
Yeah.
What should we know about it? Is there some actual possibility that Meta, which of course includes Instagram and Facebook and has been acquiring all of these up and coming social media companies, is actually going to get broken up?
So do you want me to sort of let you give you a quick background around the case itself and what's going on?
Please.
Yeah. So there are two huge antitrust trials taking place in the DC District Courtroom right now. There's a case against Google, and they've already been found liable for monopolization. So that's a remedy phase. So the judge is trying to, basically it's the part of the trial where we kind of are doing the sentencing. Like what they were found, it's civil, but they were found guilty. That's the criminal term for it. And now there's the sentencing for Google. The same courtroom, like 2 floors up, is the Meta trial. So Meta is being put on the stand for monopolization. This is historic. This is the courtroom where AT&T was broken up, where the Microsoft case in the 90s was heard. Now there are 2 cases, trillion-dollar companies. So this is like an incredible moment. So the Meta case is about basically two transactions. So you remember back when in the early 2000s, there was this site called MySpace, which was the original social network, right? And it was a weird site. You would open up the web page and you're basically your profile, and you could put music on. It was all sorts of strange stuff, but it was also like kind of cool but creepy. Like people could harass you or whatever. And Mark Zuckerberg started Facebook, and it was at Harvard first. And then it was only at college, and they competed with MySpace and said, come to Facebook where it's a safe place. Only your friends can see you. Only your college mates can see you. No weirdos are going to harass you, and we're not going to spy on you. We're not going to harvest your data. There's no advertising. And they competed over the quality of the product. Okay. So they eventually beat MySpace. And then in 2012, when there was this mobile thing that happened, like everybody had iPhones and apps became really important, Mark Zuckerberg noticed this thing called Instagram, which was gaining traction really quickly. And he said that we are worried that, you can take this photo sharing site and you can build out a social network to compete with Facebook. So we're going to buy it. And he did that, bought it for $1 billion. And then in 2014, they were worried that you could take a messaging service like WhatsApp, which was this worldwide massive messaging service, and build a social network on top of it and compete with Facebook that way. And so he then went out and he bought WhatsApp, right? Now, the idea there is Facebook had this market power in social networking services, which the government defines as connecting a social media service that allows you to connect with your friends and family. And so he got challenged on that by Instagram and WhatsApp. And to get rid of that competition, he bought them. And that's illegal. You're not allowed to eliminate competition to maintain your monopoly. That's a violation of the antitrust laws, law against monopolization. And then once he had done that, he started to engage in a lot more surveillance and started to put a lot more ads into the products, right? So he called it an ad load tax. Anyway, the government in 2019, the Federal Trade Commission under the first Trump administration filed a case saying they did unlawful monopolization. These cases take forever. The judge, James Boasberg, nicknamed Jeb, has started hearing the case in 2025, so this year, and now it is the one where there's a trial, and the judge said, look, it's a tall order for the government to prove that this is monopolization, but here's the standard they have to meet. Go to town. And now we're hearing a trial where the government put Mark Zuckerberg on the stand, Sheryl Sandberg on the stand, a whole bunch of Meta insiders, people from TikTok and lots of rivals, as well as Kevin Systrom, who's the co-founder of Instagram, to prove that that Mark Zuckerberg was trying to avoid competition by buying these companies, then underinvested in the products, so made the products worse, raised prices, which is to say increased kind of ad load, and then has market power in personal social networking. And I think the last part is Facebook a monopoly, is the part that people get hung up on because, and this is kind of the heart of the case. People think, well, yeah, sure, Google's a monopoly. Like everybody uses Google search. But Facebook, really, I can use TikTok. I can use Snap. I can use there's all these other things out there. Why is Meta a monopoly, even though it has this family of apps? And so that's kind of the core question at the heart of the case.
Well, what is the standard that'll make them successful? What do they have to prove?
So they have to prove monopolization, right? Which is, there's a number of ways to do it. You can prove it by saying they have a big market share, 60, 70, 80% of a market. You can prove it by saying they have pricing power, so they can raise prices without losing sales. And you can prove it by saying it's really hard for customers to switch from one to another, right? Or some sort of combination of those things. And the argument is not that Meta and let's take TikTok, because I think that's the biggest one. So Meta's case is, what are you talking about? We're not a monopoly. We are competing with TikTok vigorously. And that's true, right? So it's no doubt, if you want to go and watch videos or whatever, waste your time on the internet, which we all do, you can definitely look at Instagram. You can definitely look at TikTok. There's like a bunch of different sites that you can go to. But if you want to connect with friends, and this is what the government says. The government says that's true. But if you want to connect with friends and family through like a social tool, there's really only Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, Messenger, which is another Facebook product. And so they monopolize that market. Now, to give you
that's tough. Yeah, go ahead. Give me the analogy.
So the analogy is, okay, like let's say you want to buy some food, right? You can go to a supermarket or you could go to a gas station, okay? And if you're going out to pick up a pack of gum, it may not matter which one you're going to. In that sense, they are competition, right? But if you want to go out and buy like groceries, they're not competition, right? You could go to the gas station and pick up some stuff, but you're not like, that's not the same market. So this is like a common thing in antitrust. It's like, if you sell, if there's monopolization like cellophane, right, which is a famous case, DuPont, I think, made cellophane. They tried to say, well, yeah, sure, we have a monopoly in this particular, like we control kind of this plastic wrap thing, but really we compete with all packaging, right? So you have to look at all packaging. We're not a monopoly. And the Supreme Court made some decisions about how do you tell, like, whether there is a monopoly or where the sort of bounds of a market end, because you can substitute, like if you're using aluminum and there's an aluminum monopoly, which there has been historically, you can switch to magnesium in certain contexts, but it's more expensive. And so it's not really fair to say that magnesium and aluminum are in the same market. So this is a very common thing. So I think the government's case is, look, if you want to connect with friends and family, you do it through Meta's family of apps. And there are certain things in Meta's family of apps that allow them to put more advertising. Like if they know you're locked into their apps, they can put more advertising on you. And just to give you like an illustration of how they have market power, there's this woman who told this famous story about how she has like a cancer support group on Meta and or Facebook, the app actually. And she's like, we have this cancer support group. And one day I found out that it's got a lot of members and we share a lot of stuff and it has all these archives. And one day I found out that Facebook was spying on us and using the data they were capturing on us to advertise. They were selling our data to advertisers. And we hated it and we wanted to move. But what we realized is we couldn't move. It was too hard to get everybody to switch to some other, like there wasn't another form that we could go to, and it was too hard to get everybody to switch. And we had all of our content already locked into Facebook. And so, it's not like you can do that thing of having a cancer support group on TikTok, right? It's not the same product. It's a little bit like saying, well, one is plastic wrap and one is, sort of other kinds of packaging material. So that would be an example of how you could distinguish, of how you could make the argument that that the government market definition is credible and Meta's market definition is too broad. But you could go the other way too. I mean, you could definitely say, well, there are other places that you could go, and it's not really its own. Things are changing so quickly. These markets are mushing into each other. So it's not a slam dunk case by any stretch of the imagination, but that is the case.
Yeah, it's tough because as someone who's sitting here with no sympathy for Mark Zuckerberg, I find myself struggling a little bit with the defining of the market piece of this. I mean, by the logic of the cancer support group example, you also can't really do that on Instagram, but Instagram is being described as part of the Meta monopoly. Like it's part of the family of apps where you can connect with friends and family that are distinct. But is that even true? I mean, you can connect with friends and family on Twitter, I guess, but it's not going to offer the same use case as the cancer support group.
So this is why antitrust can get pretty technical. So the argument wasn't Instagram and Facebook are perfect substitutes. The argument was that if Instagram had been allowed to grow independently, they would have created a social network to rival Facebook. So they would have developed the grouping tools and all the rest of it that Facebook already had, because they would have wanted to compete and take Facebook. The way that Facebook took MySpace's user base, Instagram would have innovated to take Facebook's user base. It's just that once they became part of the same family of apps, then they didn't have to compete that way because, obviously they're not competing against each other anymore. And that was the same thing with WhatsApp. And the reason they thought that would happen is because there were a bunch of Asian social messaging services, and someone's in China, like WhatsApp, what was the one, WeChat, that started as messaging apps and then became social networks and then became commercial super apps that did all sorts of other things. And so there is a history here of apps starting as one thing and turning into a bunch of other things. So yeah, you're right. You can't do the thing on Instagram that you can do on Facebook, but in the but-for universe where Facebook had not been allowed to buy Instagram, which they clearly shouldn't have. There was a ton of evidence that the FTC at the time should have gotten and blocked it, but they did buy it. If they hadn't done that, it's likely that Instagram and Facebook would be very aggressive competitors. So just to give you one stat that came out at trial, so Instagram's co-founder, Kevin Systrom, was really mad at Mark Zuckerberg. It's very clear. So they put him on the stand, and he talked about how badly Instagram was managed after it was taken over. So he said, Zuckerberg said, we really need to go heavy into video at a certain point. And he's like, we're going to assign 300 engineers to focus on video. And he didn't give a single engineer to Instagram, right? And so he put it all into Facebook. Now, it's just to say that they underinvested in Instagram, which is one reason why, by the way, that TikTok was able to emerge, and TikTok's video editor and many of its tools are better than Meta's. It's because they underinvested because they didn't have to invest because they had the market pay. They weren't worried about any competition. But when Instagram and Facebook were competing, Mark Zuckerberg was putting a lot of pressure on his team to build photo capacity on Facebook to compete with Instagram. So the argument really is about if there are these independent rivals, they would have disciplined Facebook and would have made it so that it was a better product, that it was more, they had to compete for users. So they would have said, well, we're a higher quality product, we don't surveil you as much. But because the monopolization happened, they were able to sort of in-shitify the web, surveil, do all sorts of and not really innovate very much. Now, obviously, Meta contests each one of these claims. They say it's a better product, it's a different product, et cetera, et cetera. That's the argument from the government side.
I want to ask you what, if anything, we should take from the fact that this case started under the Trump administration and is now sort of coming to fruition under the second Trump administration. Maybe another way to ask that is, what is the Trump FTC looking like in terms of enforcement? Yeah.
So, I'm a pretty left-wing populist Democrat. I was a big, fan of Lena Khan who's the Biden kind of antitrust enforcer, and Jonathan Cantor, who was also Biden antitrust enforcer. I have to say it is super weird that the Trump administration is very good on antitrust. They have reversed pretty much most areas of Biden economic policy, not everything, but most areas. consumer protection, financial regulation, and like you just go down the line. But for some reason, they are continuing like key cases against Google, against Meta. They are doing real merger work. And so it is surprising to me how bipartisan this kind of work is, which isn't to say it's not without controversy, because it's not like, oh, we all get along. There's really bitter fights over anti-monopoly policy, but they're within parties. So there's bitter anger within the Democratic Party over anti-monopoly policy, and then there's bitter anger within the Republican Party. And for some reason, under the Biden administration and the Trump administration, the anti-monopolists kind of have control of the antitrust agencies. And so that's why these cases are going on, and they really are groundbreaking and historic. And under most other sort of transitions from Democrat to Republican administrations, you would have seen a pretty dramatic rollback of these kinds of cases. It's also, I think, notable that Trump started these cases in 2019 and 2020, although Biden expanded them and brought new ones too. So I don't want to, so this is it's very weird. It's very hard to explain, not because it's like a difficult thing to understand, but just because it's like saying up is down, to say, oh, look they're doing these things to break up the most powerful companies in the world at the same time as you see the rest of the Trump administration, which is a little bit like a pay-to-play auction. It sort of doesn't, like, it's just narrative discontinuity that doesn't make any sense, right?
Well, how much, I mean, maybe this is overly simplistic, and I'm sure I don't have a sense of the scope of cases outside of, sort of the ones that have been making news, like Mark Zuckerberg, but how much of it might be somewhat ideological? They're happy to break up something like Facebook, something like Meta, that has been so sort of liberal coded over the past few years. And
it's not that. It's not that. It's not the, like, I mean, there's definitely a sort of argument. Actually, I shouldn't say it's not that. I'm just being argumentative. Part of it is that, right?
You?
Exactly, right? I'm a hater. Part of it is that, but it goes beyond that, because, like, okay, so a couple of months ago, the Antitrust Division files a lawsuit against the merger of Hewlett-Packard and Juniper Networks. And then the next week or a couple of weeks after, the FTC files a merger prohibition lawsuit against like a private equity company called Surmodics, which makes this weird medical device that has to do with like surgery. These are not like woke things, right? This is just standard meat and potatoes antitrust enforcement. And the Google case, the Meta case, they're just doing meat and potatoes antitrust enforcement. It's not, I mean, sometimes they talk about it in the context of speech, but last week, the Gail Slater, who is the antitrust division chief, and Mark Metter, who was a new FTC commissioner, not the chair, but a new one that just got appointed, they both gave speeches about their philosophies. And they said, look, we believe that antitrust, breaking up corporate power, is a very important conservative goal. And they were talking about it in those terms. It wasn't about they were mean to Trump and it's just censorship, although part of it is that. It is ideological, but it is populist, right? So last week, a conservative Republican named Jim Jordan, who is the chair of the Judiciary Committee, an important political leader, he tried to eliminate the FTC effectively. I mean, there was still slightly more detailed. And his main opponent there, I mean, obviously we pushed back, but his main opponent was Steve Bannon, right? And it wasn't like we're going to use the FTC to defeat, Trump's enemies. It was, we have to take on corporate power. And that was the fight. And Bannon, as well as people in the White House, were able to prevent Jim Jordan from doing that. So when I say it's weird, that's what I mean. I don't have like a great explanation, except that I think a lot of the conservative populists, and it is definitely not the majority of the Republican coalition, it maybe is 10% of them, 15% of them, they genuinely believe that concentrated corporate power is dangerous to conservative principles. And the reasons aren't that different for what left-wingers think, which is that concentrated corporate power is dangerous to our vision of what a good society looks like. When someone else who's distant can boss us around, that's bad, right? And we might use different language to articulate that. And there's but like it is like basically the same analysis of power. it is a very weird thing to say that, and it is very hard to convey um, because I think Democrats and left wingers don't obviously trust the right, and they've seen so much bad faith, and it is a lot of bad faith. And I think that's true on the other side as well. But in this particular area, there really is a lot more agreement and like a lot of policy alignment that I don't think we see in other places. And it's just hard to explain.
It doesn't seem that mysterious to me. I have heard the argument that basically the Steve Bannon wing of the party, or Steve Bannon personally, is exerting influence here. That's a more genuine sort of economic populist interest. And we all saw at the end of the Biden administration the kinds of fights that were leaking over into the public sphere about Lena Khan and whether or not Kamala Harris was going to commit to keeping her on, and her unwillingness to do so, in part, it seemed, because there were corporate donors very loudly saying, going on MSNBC, and I think it was Jamie Dimon, one of those types, saying, I hope she doesn't, wink, wink, and obviously trying to pressure her to move in a different direction than Lena Khan and Biden's FTC. So when you say that this is about these intra-party fights between sort of corporatists and more economic populists, that really feels right. How and why it is that Bannon is able to win in this regard, at least in the second Trump term, is a sort of an interesting question that I think is worth exploring and watching. Because to your point, I do think that we want to, you don't want to just give endless faith and credit to someone who doesn't share all of your ideological priors. And there's some question as to how far this stuff will go and how much a sort of populist lip service is going to be used to package up a bunch of other garbage that we obviously don't want on the left.
Well, that's definitely a good way to think about it. I also would observe that the right, just like the left, is a coalition. And so part of the dynamic here is that, let's say you did agree with Steve Bannon on a lot of things, okay? Steve Bannon is in coalition with people that you don't agree with. Now, you don't agree with him on everything, but on corporate power, I think there's a fair amount of alignment. But I think if you were to look at, a bunch of people, most Republican senators, like 52 of them, voted against allowing the government to cap credit card overdraft fees, right?
Right.
Like one voted against it, Josh Hawley, right? So if you have 52 senators, right? If you have 95% of the Republicans in Congress that are super pro-corporate, and they're in a coalition with the 5 to 10% or 15% of the GOP establishment, plus a large chunk of the base that wants to fight corporate power, this is what it would look like, right? So that's what a coalition that has internal contradiction looks like, which is like most of the time they do things that are good for corporate power, monopolists, and financiers. 10 to 15% of the time they don't. And this is the 10 to 15% of the time that they're doing stuff that we like.
Yeah. Let's talk tariffs for a second. You wrote a piece a little while back called How to Prepare for the Coming Supply Chain Shock. We haven't talked tariffs since, what did he call it? The big
Liberation Day.
Liberation Day event. There has been one version of a narrative coming out of conservative news that says everything is fine. Actually, the economy bounced back. There's nothing to see here. It feels very full of cope. There are some conservative, pundits and the like who have to sort of admit that this isn't feeling good and looking good, and that the Republicans have to deal with it. But there is also a lot of hand-wringing. I think hand-wringing is not the right word. There's a lot of legitimate warning about the idea that we haven't seen the worst of it yet, and the supply chain shock is delayed. So what should people be preparing for? What do you think is likely to happen?
Well, so there's two big things in trade. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on, and it all matters. I would say there are two main things. One is trade between the US and China, with some exceptions, has effectively been stopped because we have 145% tariffs on stuff from China, and they have, 120% tariffs on stuff from us. So you basically can't really trade under those circumstances. There are exceptions, a lot of like computers and iPhones and things like that. They've made some exceptions on their side too, but that's a big deal. And then the other important aspect of what's going on is there's tremendous uncertainty. And I'm not one of those people who says, oh, there's so much uncertainty. You'll often hear on CNBC, like businesses will say, oh, so much uncertainty, really, when they don't, like when you're like, hey, we should raise taxes on rich people. They'll be like, uncertainty, unintended consequences, blah, 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 right? And it's just garbage. But when the president is saying, Vietnam, 46% tariffs. No, we're going to suspend it for 90 days. Just kidding, maybe not. And we'll do all this weird stuff with customs, and then we won't. Like, it really does make it hard to figure out, well, should I build a new plant or not? And where should I build it? Because you just don't know. Like, you have to commit to building a plant. If you're going to, say, pay $20 million to build a factory somewhere, it's going to take you a year or 2 or 3 to build it. Like, you have to know what the prices are going to be, or the tariffs, or the policy environment is going to be before you commit that money. And so what we're seeing is, because the Trump has not, it keeps changing his mind, or is constantly cut deals. You've seen this, like, everyone in corporate America is kind of on hold. They're just trying to, like, not deploy capital. They're trying to not make investments, not hire people. We try to cut spending where they can until they know more about what the actual strategy is here. And so those two things are kind of, I think they're going to slam into our economy, like, pretty soon. I mean, it takes 30 days for a ship to get from China to the west coast of the U.S. and about 45 days to get from Shanghai to New York. So we're at 31, 32 days now. So within the next 15 days, we are going to see probably significant layoffs at the ports and in the trucking sector and the logistics sector over the course, into the summer, if they don't figure out something to do about this trade conflict. What will end up happening is, we'll start to see weird shortages of parts, maybe for key things like utilities or air conditioners, or, I think we're going to have a really tough time during 4th of July because all fireworks are made in China. There's like a lot of stuff like that. So it's the small businesses are freaking out. Companies like Temu are essentially no longer selling in the US. I think, but what is very strange, America, like, the way we really make decisions, and I'm not saying this is good, it's quite bad, but the way we make decisions, we look at the stock market. And if the stock market is doing fine, then things are fine. And if the stock market is going down, then things are not fine. Remember, like, during COVID, everybody was, like, looking around to each other being like, seems like there's a serious pandemic. And then when the stock market finally went down, people were like, okay, there's a serious pandemic. It's like, that's a pretty fucked up way to make decisions about whether there's a pandemic when financial markets act. But that is how we do things right now. And what is very strange about this current moment is that, like, stocks dropped by 20%, which meant that, okay, this is a real thing. And then they came right back. And so now people, generally speaking, what you see as reporters and elites and business people are sort of like, things are kind of fine. But that's not really, like, we're kind of in this weird mode. It's like when a few days before it's like when COVID was happening before the stock market went down. It's not like COVID wasn't happening. It just hadn't been acknowledged. A little bit like Wile E. Coyote before he looks down. And that's sort of what it feels like to me. But I'm not, I don't make things. This isn't I'm not in that world of people who have to shower after they go to work. That's not I have some contacts there. And so I try to understand we talk to supply chain people. We talk to people that, I'm doing a podcast later today on organized money with a guy who makes, it's actually really cool, Simple Modern. It's a steel drinkware. It's like adult sippy cups. I love them. And but has huge problems because of tariffs. There are a lot of companies. Yeah, there we go. There are a lot of companies that are going to have, like, massive problems, and there are a lot of shortages that I think we're going to experience. But the question is whether it's going to be sort of a collapse or whether it's going to be kind of like a slower enshittification of life. So that's kind of where we are right now, but it's pretty uncertain.
I mean, a complete halt on trade with China seems extremely dramatic and almost impossible that it wouldn't be felt dramatically by not just sort of people who work directly with imports, dock workers and the like, but consumers as well. And it feels like quite the gamble. I mean, is China not, can you give us a sense of the scale of trade with China and the kind of sectors that disproportionately rely on Chinese trade, it feels extremely dramatic for everyone to kind of be shrugging their shoulders and acting like Wiley before he looks down.
Right. So the U.S., I think 14% of our economy is, give or take, is trade related. Okay. I say give or take because I think that's the number, and it makes me sound smarter if I give a number, but I might be wrong, whatever. But I'm confident, and that's what matters. But it's not, it like there are other countries like in Germany, it's like 50% or something. Like basically, if you're a smaller country and you're close to lots of other countries, trade is really important. If you're a bigger country like we are, it's less important. But the thing is that really understates the scale of our interdependence, or it might understate the scale. We don't know. This is an experiment. Like you could, maybe we import doorknobs, right? And we just don't have the factories to make doorknobs. I'm just making that up. If you are building houses, you need doorknobs, right? And if you don't have doorknobs, then those houses, even though the doorknob is like 0.001% of the value of the house, you can't finish the house without the doorknobs. So there we go. Like it's not just 14% of the economy. It's just 14% by value, but those components that we get from China go into like everything. And so we don't know, and you could re-engineer some of your products to take some of that stuff out. There are some things you can like source from other places, but there are a lot of things that we get from China that we only get from China, or that we get so much from China that it's basically there's no other real sources. And so it could be everything from like, import certain chemicals, like the chemical that goes into dollar bills, like a key chemical comes from China, which is like kind of funny. Prom dresses, actually books, Bibles. I went through the 2018, I went through a bunch of comments. There were people lobbying against tariffs. And one of them was like the Religious Book Association, like basically people who sell Bibles. They were like, we can't make Bibles here. They make them in China because they're better. They're better at it. And it was like all this stuff that we just don't make here. I mean, think about it. The first mass production industry was the book industry. That's the printing press from the like 1400s, 1500s, like that. And then we don't do that here anymore. Like it's crazy. So all of these things, and lots obviously like active pharmaceutical ingredients for medicines, lots of medical stuff, circuit boards, like all of these really vital things, everything that goes into drones, and there's all the high tech stuff that's really cool, right? All that stuff is they're either made in China or they're important components in China. So we don't know how much this is going to impact. How much this is going to impact us, when it's going to impact us, the sectors it's going to impact us. The one thing that we do know is that the first sector to really feel it is going to be like the trucking sector and the logistics sector. In China, they are already shutting down factories. So that's the other thing is China's a black box. People love to come up with all sorts of fantasies about what China is like. The truth is we don't know. They don't have a free press. There aren't a lot of foreigners there. The government has shut down a lot of the data sources on the economy. We just don't know what's going on over there. We don't know anything about the politics. It's all rumors. So, but it seems like they're having really big problems. Those problems are going to be here because, they make things, they transport things. Those things take 30 to 45 days to come over here, get distributed, put in warehouses, and sold. So there's a lag before it hits us. The other thing is, there's some inventory stock here, so companies might keep 2 to 3 months of inventory. So maybe they'll be able to sort of sustain it for 2, 3 months without really people kind of noticing. I know car companies are, they're all trying to figure out how they can avoid tariffs. And when they do have to pay, they will eventually have to pay the tariffs, or they negotiate them away with the White House. But if they do have to eventually pay them, like, none of them want to be the first one to raise prices on consumers because they'll get shit on by the White House. So what they're doing right now is they're stocking up their cars in they're keeping them offshore if they can, that are meant for import, or they're putting them into parking lots here so that they can wait for 14 days before they have to pay the tariff. So there's all sorts of games being played, but it's like they're all trying to delay the hit because they're all afraid of the White House, which I guess is kind of cool that they're afraid of raising prices. Like, when was the last time we saw a political leader scare businesses into not raising prices. But eventually I think we're going to start seeing, like, because once a car company does raise prices, they're all going to raise prices. And so that's the kind of thing that's going to happen.
It is fascinating to see how that plays out politically. And I wonder what you make of the story about the kind of fight between Trump and Bezos over whether or not Amazon could start listing the tariff costs alongside the cost of products on Amazon in a way that puts the blame for the higher prices on the Trump administration and takes it off of Amazon and the resellers, and the Trump White House obviously being very displeased about that.
Yeah, so the story was that
Yeah.
Amazon was going to put, a separate tariff line charge on your order, right? So you could see the cost of the tariffs. Amazon sort of denies that. They said, oh, it's only in one part of the business that explicitly competes with Temu. But when this was reported, Trump called Jeff Bezos and demanded he stop it. And Bezos then said, yes, we're going to get rid of this. So I think one of the things you do see, like, all over the place, in DC, they passed a law. This is common, but they passed a law saying, there's going to be a minimum wage for tipped workers. And so all of these restaurants started putting a fee on their bill of like 3% or something like that, and saying, this is because of your stupid city council. And businesses love doing this kind of thing to blame someone else for price hikes. So, there are companies that are doing, putting tariff charges. I think Temu is doing it because it's existential for them. But it's surprising to me that there aren't more doing it. But I also think it's a little bit like, well, fuck you. We have policy choices in this country, and we don't make enough here, and we need to change that. And you don't necessarily know how much tariffs are costing your consumers. So it really is just like a political attack. Because the other thing to understand about how because tariffs are kind of complicated, you're not tariffing the consumer, like the end consumer price. Like, so like take a pair of Nike shoes that costs like $140, right? So when they say we're going to put tariffs of say 100% on them or something, I'm making up numbers, they don't mean they're going to put 100% on $140, which means that the price would be $280. What they're saying is they're going to tariff the wholesale price, the imported price. And those shoes come into the country, like Nike imports them at $20. So when Nike buys it from a Vietnamese supplier, the Vietnamese supplier charges them $20. And that's the price that gets tariffed. So it would be a $20 shoe that they buy. It gets tariffed at 100%. So that's $40 to Nike. Nike charges $140. So instead of $120, it's not pure profit, but let's just say it's profit. They now have $100 profit. Out of that profit, that gross profit, they then, do distribution, they do marketing, they do a bunch of other stuff. But it's not like they can choose whether to absorb it as a hit to profits. They can choose whether to raise prices. There's a number of choices that they have, but it isn't necessarily the case that there's like a 1-to-1 increase of prices when there's a tariff. But a company like Nike has its own distribution. But if you're talking about a smaller company that makes, say, like a board game, right? A lot of board games, most board games are made in China. Then, let's say you import the board game and it's $10 at the wholesale imported price. They then send it to a distributor. That distributor does 100% markup of $20 because they have to make a profit. And that distributor gives it to a retailer and they have to do 100% markup. So it's $40 because they have to pay the rent and all the rest of it. So if you take the wholesale price of $10 and you tariff it at 100%, it goes up to $20, goes to the distribution chain, now it gets doubled, and then it goes to the retail chain, it gets doubled again. So even though the initial tariff is $10, it gets on the wholesale item, that actually translates into a $40 consumer price increase if all of the markups stay the same across the whole supply chain. So that end retailer could say your tariff charge is $40. The truth is the tariff charge that the government collected is only $10. So there's all sorts of bullshit that's involved in making that tariff line item charge. And I think that a company like Amazon would just be guessing as to what that would be anyway. And so it's really just a political attack I mean, it's not illegitimate. Their tariffs are a real thing, but that is like a little bit of the complicating factors here, and maybe why Trump. I mean, Trump was mad because he doesn't want to look bad, but that's also like, any politician that actually tries to make any policy changes at all is going to encounter this dynamic.
It also does feel a lot like the conversations we were having in COVID about the fact of COVID and everyone having this expectation that there was these supply chain issues that were driving up prices meant that companies could just raise prices and price gouge without there actually being a need on their end. And I do worry about, yes, makes Trump look bad in this instance, and you can stick it to Trump to put the tariff charge on something. But also, is this going to be cover for corporations just to do what they frequently do? It also is worth noting, given your example about the tipped wage, that Muriel Bowser is trying to get rid of the tipped wage policy and put it back down to like $4 and change an hour. I saw this news this morning. So here's to liberal Black mayors in predominantly Black cities. Seems to be the same old story over and over again. I want to ask you while we're still on tariffs. Sorry, I'm not asking you to weigh in on my frustration with Black mayors across the country.
I think that we don't talk about Black politics enough, and we don't talk about how like Black politics is very aligned with Wall Street, and it's really fucked up. And like, it's always fun and nice to like yell about and be like, oh, those liberal elites are all hypocrites, and but it's like, dude, we're like, American politics is super fucked up in every like part of our like coalition, all parts of coalitions. Why wouldn't it be fucked up in Black politics too? It's like, it's a really important conversation that we have to have. In
some ways, my hot take is that in some ways it's worse because for all of the reasons, Black politicians are frequently representing lower income districts, et cetera, et cetera.
Black people don't have any money.
Fundraising.
There's no money. It's like,
and given the emphasis on fundraising within the party, are going to be more susceptible to being bought off. Like, not because you're like a worse person or anything, but if you don't have as much money, you're more vulnerable to corruption, which is why I don't think it's a coincidence that you have the Jim Clyburns of the world taking more pharmaceutical money than anybody else in Congress, and also throwing South Carolina to Joe Biden very conveniently in the 2020 election. Like, go ahead.
No, you're right. But I would actually say that it's more deeply rooted because it isn't just like that. The fundraising, political fundraising is one level, but there's also the fact that like the actual infrastructure for social goods just isn't the same in Black communities as it is, or just in poor communities, right? And those are disproportionately Black. Not all Black communities are poor, but like it's disproportionate. And so it's like, if you want internet access, right, high-speed internet access, you're just less likely to have it if you're in a Black community than if you're not, than or in a poor community than not. And so when Comcast comes in, or Xfinity or whatever they're called now, when they come in and they're like, they say to someone, hey, if you do this corrupt thing, we'll get some of your people high-speed internet access. It's just a more compelling pitch because there is no social infrastructure. So it's like, there are a lot of reasons that you could like, Black people and monopolies are a fascinating conversation because you have to like deal with this problem of, it's just harder to say no to a monopolist when you don't have any other alternative in terms of social infrastructure. But it doesn't make the problem, like, it just makes the problem something that we really need to talk about instead of like pretend. Like Muriel Bowser is doing that for a reason, right? And she is, so anyway, I'll which to say that like, I really hope that we can like start having these conversations in a real way because like we really need to.
No, I completely agree. And I would just add that it's even more pernicious because on top of all of the dynamics just described, when people then notice and point it out, the backlash is, why are you criticizing them because they're Black? And there is this sort of immunity that gets created for the bad behavior. So I suspect you won't really hear much about what Mayor Bowser is doing right now anywhere on the mainstream news. I suspect that someone like my predecessor, Simone Sanders, isn't going to open her show today with DC mayor cutting tipped wage for restaurant workers, just like I doubt she opened her episode a month ago or so when it happened with DC mayor paints over Black Lives Matter sign on 16th. Not that that's like substantive, it's just a symbolic gesture. But the alacrity with which these people will fall in line is really galling, given how much juice they get out of being sort of representational and principled from a racial perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a problem. I mean, I think there are like a lot of reasons for that. I mean, there's a problem, I think, in the way that we talk about identity in general. So, I'm Jewish, so I'll just take that lane. It's like conflating ethnic group, like my ethnicity, with like a foreign country is just a weird thing to do. And it's like, I don't get to vote for Netanyahu. Like, why are you spending my money? Like, it's like, that's weird. Like, I don't know. I don't, it's an ethical system to me. It's my like, there's nothing to do with like, in Israel, they're not even funny. Like, what the fuck? It doesn't make any sense. So it's like, but as like a lot of Jews are raised this way. Like, the older generation, a lot of this is a generational split. I think there's a reason the younger Black people are drifting away from the Democratic Party and drifting away from the Black establishment. They're drifting away from Black churches. Like, it's the same thing that's going on in kind of every facet of our society. And I think, older like Jewish boomers were very like into Israel because it like gave them like, they're very into the idea that anti-Semitism is this totalizing force everywhere because it gives them a sense of purpose. And maybe they experienced it as kids, like in the 70s or whatever. But it's like not a big thing in the US. Like we pretend that there's like the elites have to say there's a lot of anti-Semitism and like there's not. Like it's just, I mean, yeah, there's assholes, in every society, but it's like not a particularly big deal. Like America's good to the Jews. Like it just is. Like, so I don't know. The point is, I think we should have these more. You're gonna
get me in trouble again. I've paid my dues. I've taken my licks.
But here, the point is that the reason that anti-monopoly work is so interesting is because I think you have this overall dynamic where it is like there are all of these questions of social policy, and they do link to all of these questions about identity. And so, you do see like Muriel Bowser, who also, cut deals with Amazon and has, and I'm like not like criticizing her, but you have, deep alignment with like the Anti-Defamation League and what, and Meta's content moderation policies. And so, the danger of consolidated corporate power is that it does allow sort of certain forms of toxic, I think, deceptive politics that avoids talking about power. It's really racecraft. It's Barbara Fields, it really allows that to become far more powerful because, you're not just like, you don't have to convince 10,000 stores to do something you want. You can just like seize control over one infrastructure, over Amazon or over Meta or something like that. So I think that's, I don't know. I guess we're kind of off topic here, but like when you have a guy, but you have a guy like Mark Zuckerberg saying, like, I think everybody should have, an AI chatbot therapist. And it's like what that guy thinks about how we communicate and what we communicate matters in a way that it shouldn't. I mean, and I'm not saying he's a bad guy or whatever. I'm saying like no one should have that amount of power. Like no one, I shouldn't, look, I mean, I think what I think, I realize I'm in a minority of Jews. Like most Jews are like super into Israel. I get it. But like the views of most, like we should have these debates on some level of equality, right? And and the level of inequality and just in terms of power, not in terms of money, but power is just so extreme. And I think that's like the core problem that we're dealing with right now.
Well, Matt, if you decide to write your next book, Race as Monopoly, the racialization of monopoly, or somehow juxtaposed to.
Can I give you a quick aside, which I think is really interesting about
real quick though, because I gotta jump to my
you gotta jump. So,
not yet AI therapist. But go ahead.
You know what? Another time.
Okay. All right. Well, tell people really quickly where they can find you and your work on the internet and beyond.
Okay. So I am a co-host of a podcast called Organized Money, and I write for our newsletter called Big, so at thebignewsletter.com, and I am I'm a researcher at the American Economic Liberties Project. So thanks so much.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Matt. Thank you for listening. You know, you can get an additional episode of Bad Faith Podcast every Monday at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. Thanks again. Take care of yourselves and keep the faith. Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.